First of all, welcome to you all and thank you for joining. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Richard. I lead the Mindful Business Charter, and we are delighted to have with us today Charles Vogel. Let me give you a bit of an insight into how this came about, because as you will appreciate with MBC, we put a lot of store on the community that we build, the community of members that form the MBC. And that's led me to think a lot about what we mean by community and how we organize the community and what different people want from the community and so on and so forth. And I came across a book called The Art of Community, which Charles wrote a few years ago now, which I found utterly enthralling and hugely useful in terms of understanding and thinking about not just the community of MBC, but the communities that we are part of, that we create in all aspects of our lives. And I'm also very conscious, so as well as the community of MBC, very conscious of how important community is to our own individual well-being and how that sense of community within our organizations, but also our wider lives, supports our well-being. And also the communities that our MBC leads will be creating around them within their organizations in order to support the implementation of MBC within those workplaces. So all of that led me to, as I say, be very interested in Charles's book. I reached out to him earlier this year to say hello and to say we'd be really interested in talking to you. And Charles has very kindly agreed to give up his time to talk to us today about community. And I'm also conscious that not only has he agreed to do that, but it's quite early in the morning for Charles. So I'm particularly grateful for that. Charles, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. Talk a little bit about how you first started thinking about communities.
Well, I didn't know I was thinking about community. I spent the first, let's call it 15 years of my adulthood working on projects that I thought were very important. I worked on homelessness issues in Southern California. I served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Sub-Saharan Africa, where I was working on health issues in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. Got to the United States, and I started making a film that would eventually get funded by PBS about a family surviving the Cambodian genocide and becoming American. And then while I was waiting tables in New York City, I experienced worker abuse and started organizing restaurant workers, largely immigrant workers, for justice reasons. What I didn't know I was doing in all those adventures was I was taking on projects where I could never depend on transactional relationships to bring people together to be effective. What I didn't know that I was doing was I was working in crucibles where I had to learn how to bring people together around shared values and purpose in order to accomplish goals that nobody could do by themselves. In my mid-30s, I went to graduate school to study religion, philosophy, and ethics. And when I was on campus, I was shocked how when I would go to leadership events, they all assumed that leadership was done in a context of transactional relationships. And I didn't have the language I've just used with you now to explain the difference of what I was doing and what they were teaching, but I just remember totally confused and offended by what they called leadership. And while I was on campus studying religion, I was studying people who have been coming together for far over 1,000 years around shared values and purpose in ways that make them powerful and resilient, especially in the face of existential threat. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. And I realized that when I finished graduate school, I now had a degree in religion. My experience was making genocide film and living in Africa and working in an AIDS epidemic. I didn't want to do any of those things anymore. And I followed my wife to California, into the land of tech, and didn't know how to plug into the economy. And I had a lunch with a guy named Kevin Lin, who had recently founded a company now known as Twitch. And he shared with me that he knew that the company was going to grow a lot, but he wanted to connect the people who were showing up on the platform more powerfully than they were. And when that came out of his mouth, I remembered my head wanted to explode with ideas to share with him. And so I went home to write what I thought was going to be a 10-page white paper that Kevin Lid could use for his multi-billion-dollar global tech company. And if somebody else thought it was helpful, great. But when I started writing, I was very surprised when what came out was book length. I was even more surprised when the first publisher that saw it wanted to publish it. I was shocked when it came out and it won awards and found an audience. And then in 2019, Google approached me and told me they'd already been training leaders in the company based on the work. And it had been so effective, they wanted to create a multi-year relationship with me. That's how I became a Google thought leader. So all of that happened by accident after spending 15 years trying to do things I couldn't do by myself and doing the hard work. It sounds fun in the telling. The hard work of learning how to bring people together around shared values and purpose in order to be more effective and resilient and adaptable.
Thank you. And in the book, you talk about the meals that you created at graduate school. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's quite, and for me, that was a really interesting insight into how, I guess, not first, but how you went about creating community in that context.
It's one of the experiences that is easy to reference. So I got to graduate school. I was in Connecticut. My now wife and I moved there and knew virtually no one, as people do when they move to a new school. And it was a really lonely place. And the school was really famous, is really famous. And we don't look like the people who are associated with that school. And it was intimidating, to say the least. And I discovered that other people were also walking around feeling disconnected from this really intimidating place, even though all of us had been invited to spend years there. So remembering words of some mentors and some sages that I'd read, we started hosting dinners in our little home there on Prospect Street every Friday night, which sounds way more grand than the actual experience of it. We didn't have money. In fact, we were losing money every week because I was in graduate school. And so the first stop on this grand adventure was to Goodwill, where we purchased enough used plates so we would physically have enough plates to have people over and share meals with us. And when I say we would host dinners, what I mean was I would just make an enormous amount of food and figure out if anybody was going to show and have meals with us. And there were, in the beginning, people came because it was novel and they were new on campus and wanted to meet people. But after that, we were not the most exciting thing on a campus of 15,000 people. So very often, very few people would come out of 15,000. And my wife has reminded me sometimes no one came. And we kept doing it because we just believed there was something important there. And the people who did come, we were forming special relationships. Well, I'll just skip to 2 years later when we kept doing this. And we calculated that we had hosted over 500 people in our little home on these Goodwill China plates over those 2 years. And the work of the shopping and the cooking and the cleaning had become so onerous that we couldn't continue. So we hosted a meeting of these people who were regulars, who are now our friends, and said, now what? And what came out of that is several of them agreed that they would be a dinner leader, which is to say on a Friday night, I didn't have to lead the dinner, somebody else would lead. And then others in the group said, well, they'd also help. So that person wasn't doing it by themselves. And so we created this team that just simply made a meal we wanted to eat. It was no more complicated than that. And then sat down in a space where there was no evaluation, there were no grades, and there was no entrance fee, and there was no allegiance to swear. And we sat down and shared a meal for no less than 3 hours, often 6 o'clock to at least 9 o'clock, and very often later. And I'll tell you something funny happened, Richard. After the first 2 years, the dinners became very popular. So popular, we physically didn't have enough room to host all people who wanted to come. And so our friend Sam handled the wait lists we were running because people wanted to join this meal that had no evaluation and no other agenda than to make friends. And then Arjan handled the sponsorships because the undergrads who agreed to cook often didn't have the budget to buy groceries for 14 people. And so others stepped up and made sure the groceries were purchased. And it sounds very sophisticated, but what I really want to underline here is it was just a couple people who went to Goodwill, bought used plates, and then made meals we like to eat and explored, did anybody else want to sit down on a Friday night and make friends?
And from that evolved, or from that came that sense of volunteering for other people, the opportunities for other people to serve, and so on and so forth.